The HX Collective explores the human experience through three main channels of life: work, relationships, and self. With raw, authentic conversations, the podcast investigates how challenges can become powerful teachers, leading to personal growth and deeper connections. Rooted in humanity-centered design, each episode reflects a commitment to doing good and doing well, featuring diverse voices and generational perspectives. Expect gripping stories of struggle and success, with thought-provoking discussions and concrete tools and tactics that encourage you to rethink your relationship with distress, helping you to establish your full human experience. This is the HX Collective channel. Hello, friends. Welcome to our next episode of the HX Collective podcast, where my guest and I come together in a united mission to elevate human flourishing. Today is a particularly special day. As a person who is relatively new to podcasting, I have to tell you, when you bring someone into the world of this conversation who is an expert podcaster, I can tell you we're going to learn a ton today from my good friend, Andrew Cohn. He is the founder and president of Lighthouse Consulting. He's a counselor, an executive coach, and a consultant, and he helps leaders and their organizations achieve incredible outcomes. And he is an accomplished podcaster. In fact, we're going to include his information in the show notes. It's spirituality in leadership. And what I appreciate about this idea of talking with leaders about the concept of spirituality and how that impacts us as leaders, the real mission of his podcast is to destigmatize and de-dogmatize the whole essence of spirituality in a way that creates access to greater performance and greater outcomes. Andrew, thank you so much for agreeing to spend time with me today. I have enjoyed so much getting to know your work and getting to know you and so many of the interesting things that you are communicating and promoting and shepherding. So before we dig into our conversation, may I ask you to give our audience a little bit more background on how we've come together in this moment in time and how we are united in our desire to really elevate the human experience?
Well, thank you for that introduction. I have to somehow muster up the energy to match you, but I think I've given up on that. Thank you so much for the introduction to be here, Deb, and it's really a pleasure. And I've listened to certainly some of your podcast episodes, and I know you have with some of mine. And there's just an awful lot of synergies, and I'm grateful to be contributing to your podcast in any way that I can. I'd be really curious to hear from your point of view how we've sort of come together in this way. But from my point of view, we actually met in a very practical way, working our circles in working with a particular client are not quite concentric really at all, but there's a little bit of overlap. You know, I do my work with them and then you do your work with them, but if we're lucky, we can have a couple of meals together. And so that, of course, is where the real work gets done, is over the meals and the real bonding. But I appreciate well, certainly the work that you do, and I'm learning more about that. I'm talking about your day job work that you do. And I'm always grateful to share about mine as well. And I consider myself just I consider myself a very fortunate person. My work now is a second career for me. My podcast, which is about 3 years old now, is my labor of love. And it's just nice. It's nice when you recognize that you're on a really good path. I can't say that about every single area and every dimension of my life. I'm not complaining. I'm just, some things are just 10 out of 10 and some things they're still blossoming. But with respect to some of these work dimensions, I'm super fortunate and recognize it. And I'm happy to speak with you in whatever ways that would support the conversation that you're fostering here.
Well, I love that you've given us a little taste of the second career. That was a real serendipitous moment when I learned how you began your professional career and how it led you to the present work you're doing in leadership. So say a little bit about that first journey or chapter, and then how it brought you to launch Lighthouse Consulting. And we'll get into more of the conversation around where did the spirituality element of leadership get birthed. But first, career.
I grew up and always wanted to be a lawyer. My father was a lawyer for part of his career. My best friend's dad was a lawyer. My uncle was and is a lawyer and is my lawyer. So thank you, Peter, for all your work. At 80, he's still going strong, and my counsel, and I am his in some ways as well. And so I always knew I wanted to go to law school. I went to law school. I got a job working with a good firm in Los Angeles, and was very fortunate. It was a small firm that was a split off from a larger New York law firm. And because they were split off, they were very clear about, well, we want to have this different identity. So they were a jeans and boots law firm on the west side of Los Angeles, and just good people, really good people. And because it was a small firm, I was able to be exposed to a lot more interesting work, and that stretched me. You usually don't get to go in and be taking expert depositions like 6 weeks after you pass the bar exam. But in a small firm, that's what you do. So they taught me, they trained me, really, really good people. Culture-wise, they were, it was about billable hours, and that's what it's about. And I have some stories to share about that. And the firm, I would share this story. Rather than have a regular golf game, the three founding partners would rent a gym every Monday night for a full court basketball game.
Oh, wow.
And invite some of their buddies, because one of them was born and raised in LA, the other one was from New Jersey, but had been there for a very long time. And so I was happy to jump into the basketball game, and so I was able to connect with some of these partners in that way. Very, very big believer in connecting with the bosses outside of work if you can do that. And there's something about going belly to belly and throwing elbows and, et cetera, with people. But really, that was the culture of the firm. And I say that in a very complimentary way. So I was very fortunate to have stumbled onto that. And that's what I always wanted to do until I didn't. And it was one of those realizations that this is not really the way I want to spend the rest of my career. It was a difficult thing to walk away from because, I'm living in Los Angeles. I'm in my late 20s. Well, I left when I was in my early 30s, but 33, 34, about 7 years into practice. And I was making a very good living. I was single. I had my different communities in Los Angeles. I had my personal growth community, which I could talk about. I had my Aikido community. I had some family who lived out there. And it was just a wonderful lifestyle. And I knew that, well, actually what I knew, you would counsel me and say, Andrew, be careful, this is a limiting belief. But I kind of expected that if I changed careers as I did in my mid 30s, I would probably need to work an extra decade longer than I would have had to work if I had stayed with the law firm. And I left about 6 months before they were going to make me partner, and all indications were that that's what they were going to do. And I was lucky to get out when I did, because I didn't have any of the golden handcuffs that can happen with people in certain kinds of jobs. So should I continue? Questions?
I was going to say, so I wanted to make sure that our audience had that recognition or understanding that there was a real earnestness and meaningfulness in some of the early parts of your career. And when I think about lawyers, I think about culture, and then we get to this subject matter of leadership. You have a particularly unique point of view that I know comes to life when you're working with clients, and a lot of our shared client, of course, is in professional services. So when did the awakening happen, or when did this shift occur when you came to the realization that maybe law wasn't going to be the long-term career trajectory for you?
I don't know. There were a couple of moments, but I don't know that there was a moment. There are moments in the practice where, another lawyer on the other side, and it's all, of course, very contentious. That's the whole point, this adversarial system, especially in the wacky world of California litigation, where everybody sues for everything. And I did at times, I was in the courthouse, not the same courtroom, but the same courthouse with O.J. Simpson on a number of occasions. This was back a while ago, and I was in L.A. But there were times where lawyers were just doing things that were like, really? That you're going to take that position? It's like, I don't know what I'm allowed to say explicitly on this podcast, but people were, I felt like saying to them that thing that I wouldn't want to say to them. And I know for me, and maybe it was just my personality, this is so unnecessary. It's just unnecessary to operate in this way. And yet the practice and the sort of guardrails of the practice, I don't know if they encourage that kind of behavior. That may be an exaggeration, but they certainly tolerated it. And it was one of those things where I just don't like to be in this particular watering hole. And the question was, when did I realize that? And what I would say is I was fortunate because I was exposed to personal development work when I was young. I was exposed to meditation and group learning and group process and asking important questions when I was in college. I mean, I remember when I was I'm a very happy and proud alum of Boston University, and I participated in a study abroad program. And before they sent this cadre of kids over to France, they took us up to this camp in New Hampshire that the university ran. And they had these counselors who were having us do things like trust falls and walks in the snow. It was in the wintertime before we left in January, walks in the snow, making fires together, talking about some important questions. I had never had any sort of exposure to like these kinds of questions with people I didn't know very well. And just for some reason, the energy just deepened and dropped, and I'm connected to these people and we trusted each other. And that was really helpful as we launched and went to the other side of the pond for, in my case, 6 months, for some people longer. And it was like, wow, this is really cool. And then when I was in law school, I did some professional development seminars, public seminars that are done around the world. And I was very happy that I stumbled upon this particular group. And I did one of these things the summer after my first year of law school, another one a year later, another one a year later. And by that point, it's like this was going to be a part of my life in some form. So when I started in the law practice, I thought, well, this is something that somehow I could just work into my work. These important questions about deliberately living. How do I want to live? How do I want to support my clients and the choices that they make? I would say that if I had to categorize what I was thinking about at that time in terms of development, it would be that sense of like, how do I want to operate? It was really very much a how thing back then, but that's what it is when you're in your 20s. So, and we may come back to that. After a few years of law practice, I went back to school, in not to change careers, just because honestly, it was a convenient master's program to do in weekend format. So I only had to miss 5 days a year of work when they did the summer retreats, but it was a master's program in applied spiritual psychology. It was a program that I heard about, that I was living close enough that I could walk to where the classes were being delivered one weekend a month. And I knew about the program. I wasn't planning to do it. There were circumstances. All of a sudden I was in it. I was glad. And by the time I started to get into it and I was learning these counseling skills, and you may have some questions about what is spiritual psychology, and that's totally cool. But just in terms of my story, and I realized, okay, once I start opening this up and having these conversations with people, I couldn't not have these conversations with people, if that makes sense. And that what became clear to me is, okay, I don't know that I could, maybe I'll go back to my law practice at the end of these 2 years. And of course, it was all through. I mean, there was no time off. I was still working, billing, doing what I was doing. But even if I did go back, I wouldn't be the same person when I went back.
It makes so much sense, and I think such an unusual journey, and what a gift. And I want to pick up on the thread in this concept of spiritual psychology, and how, for context and for our audience's benefit, how you see this intersection of spirituality and leadership, and how do they work together, particularly when we think about human flourishing.
Yeah, well, human flourishing is your bailiwick, and I'd love to hear you talk about how that fits in, just in how you define it. And I know you've given this a lot of thought. So, spiritual psychology is, as I understand it, it's an approach to counseling, to healing therapeutically, that includes what I would call universal spiritual principles. So that means in addition to counseling people, and of course, everything we did for 2 years was in trios, where it was practice, practice, practice. So at 3 o'clock, I'm the counselor in the counselor chair, and at 3:30, I'm the client. And that's the way the time was used. So when you get out of these weekends, you're like, turned inside out and open and becoming more skilled. But with an overlay of universal spiritual principles. So in addition to practicing different counseling approaches, person-centered therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, the principles would include forgiveness, acceptance, loving. Those to me are the big three, but then there's others as well. And from my point of view, now of course I'm biased, having been another proud alum of that program, is how could you not? If I'm wrestling with some issue, and I have wrestled with issues over the years, and we've shared some of that in recent months, how could I not how could I exclude the notion of acceptance or forgiveness, both forgiving another person, if that's appropriate, and myself? It's got to be part of the package to me. Otherwise, you're leaving out a huge chunk of consciousness and power and energy. So for me, do I go through the front door with my corporate clients talking in this way? No, I don't. I don't believe, I'm not interested in proselytizing or telling them they should be using these words. In fact, as you know, in my podcast, I don't define what spirituality is. I what's the word that I don't have I don't own the term. I don't have, and people think differently. And why should I try to define it in a way that in any way, like you said, the point of the podcast is to de-dogmatize and expand the conversation. And I could be defining something in a narrow way. I think you've heard me say this before, but I remember reading this wonderful book about leadership in which the author said to define something is to distrust it, which was a powerful statement, right? And sometimes, well, why do I have to define this? Maybe I don't. Maybe I don't. And I find that it works better when I don't.
Well, and that's what I was going to say. I've noticed, and when you bring your guest in, that because you aren't trying to guide everyone through a particular channel to validate a particular definition or point, it creates room for real beauty in the exploration, really, of the conversation around, in many ways, what does leadership mean, and the expression of excellence in leadership, and then how the spiritual realm ties in, and there's so much variety when you have so many different guests. And and I'm curious, when you are looking at it first through the lens of leadership effectiveness, or when you might be coaching or counseling clients and really helping them incorporate all the dimensions to be kind of wholehearted leaders, what are some of the struggles that your clients are often asking you to engage, and what are the observations that you have around this area of the leadership experience and the struggle sometimes that we may have?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's a lot. So, how many hours do we have for this? Two? No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
I'll do
Don't be
part
frightened
one,
away,
two,
listeners.
three.
Yeah, don't want to scare away your listeners. So, wow, that's a big question. So let me just talk about what comes to mind for me. And by the way, I want to backpedal just slightly, because what you just pointed out about not pushing a certain type of conversation is what you're labeling, which I appreciate, is so much can open up when we don't push a conversation a certain way and rather stay open and ask an inviting question and watch it go somewhere. There's so much that's available when we don't fill in the blanks and allow the blanks to be filled. So thank you for pointing that out. So what are leaders struggling with? Well, I could just, again, what's top of mind for me with some recent work, overwhelm. How to, like, oh, I need to find some time to do ABC. And I've learned that, no, you don't find time. You have to make time. You have to take time. You have to seize time. You don't find it, because with most leaders that I know, they're very busy, especially people with families or relationships or lives outside of work and board membership, et cetera. There's no finding time as if it's just in an empty box waiting for you. You've got to make it and be vigilant and sometimes fight for it, for sure. That's one area. Certainly just the increasing complexity and separation, this sort of tangentiality of teams and relationships now, where we're working virtually and we're working globally. And I was just speaking with you to give me some support for my podcast. Thank you. My production team is in the Philippines and in Azerbaijan, and, that's the world we're operating in. There's no, oh, I'll just talk to somebody about this when I see her over coffee tomorrow morning. So we have to be a lot more deliberate in terms of forming and deepening relationships. That, by the way, is a pressure for leaders, because I know, and some of this is generational. I'd be curious to know if this is your experience too, but the leaders of a certain age believe that we just need to bring people back to the office and that will bring us together. And it's like, no, it doesn't happen by osmosis. particularly for younger employees who are less eager to come into the office without an explicit reason to do so, which I understand. I didn't grow up in that world, but I understand that wanting to know, why do I need to do this? Why do I need to go sit on the train or drive in traffic or whatever it is? And it puts pressure on leaders to use time in a certain way, because it doesn't happen by itself, to create conversations, to create, project meetings, to structure conversations in a certain way. That's pressure. But what, as I like to say, it's good pressure. It's healthy pressure, because I need that pressure as a leader, because if I can't justify it, then it's probably not a good decision. But it puts pressure on me to explain my thinking, to be transparent, to put myself in a position to be, well, this is what I think. Tell me what I'm missing, or tell me even how to do it better. Right?
Well, I'm appreciating what you're saying, because I see this too when I look at leaders within my client base, and everything you're describing is so on point. And I want to kind of put a punctuation on this notion of finding time. What a mythical construct, right? As if there's, some sort of treasure hunt of, buried treasure. And I'm going to go, oh, look, I found a treasure trove of time. And there really is that consciousness of being very intentional and purposed. And to your point, how we may have been in generations, for sure. I think there's a lot of spillover benefit in kind of old constructs where we wouldn't have been conscious around the occasion of the casual conversation because we're bumping into each other in the office, or having the proverbial water cooler conversations, and not really understanding that those were gifts or outcomes based on the circumstances, but we weren't designing for the impactful conversation. We weren't prioritizing the need to engage in relationship building in a way that really meets people where they are. And so I think our current space is requiring us to be a lot more creative, a lot more dialed in, and a lot more purposed in our effort. And so I see what you're describing, and I do think it is a bit a trope to say, we'll come back to the office and it'll be the way it is. I often say, when people say I want to return to the way things were, and I said it's impossible to return to a set of circumstances that no longer exist, like that construct no longer exists. And so I'm curious to see, how this is going to unfold, particularly when leaders have a real struggle. There's a real sense of pressure. And yet, as you said, that's good pressure. When you see leaders that are embracing the realities of the moment and the experiences of overwhelm, when they get it right, when they are stepping into a new place of prioritizing their time or choosing the relationship building with creativity and intention, like what does it look like when leaders are thriving or starting to move in a space, notwithstanding some of the struggle or challenge?
Yeah. Well, it looks like relief. It looks like, it's like kind of like, thank God we've sort of eddied into this place, away from the turbulence. So that's a feeling level. It feels that way. It's something that I think it's sort of like we can recognize progress. I mean, one of the things that I do as a coach is I'm always encouraging my clients to be more reflective. So, for example, you were able to carve out this time for what you said was most important, and that's new for you. What did you have to do to make that happen? To identify what those behaviors are that really served them and the people around them that they now have more time for, the people that matter most. What is it that you did? So that reflecting and identifying what the successful and more effective behavior was, to be really aware of it. Because the result is new, but the behavior to create the result was probably also new. And also new often means also uncomfortable very often, right? Because you're reboundarying, and that can be a challenging thing. But it feels like relief. It looks like something that, and maybe I'm skipping over the celebratory period and going right to, and we have to keep it up and we have to keep maintaining it, because it's one of these, it's a little bit like I think about a landscaping reference. And I remember in my home in suburban Philadelphia, where it was beautiful land around there, And I remember talking with this guy who was my landscaper at the time. And I said, I want to do this, and not too much, a little bit, whatever. And he said, you just know that you really have to work to maintain that. He said, because if you don't, Mother Nature will take it right back. And so it is with time and with the inertia of organizational time, especially when we like to think we control our time, but there's many others that have an important hand on the lever, including our partners and kids and families and things outside of work. So we control how we respond to other people's influence on our time. We don't necessarily control all the dimensions of our time. So it requires a level of vigilance that, and again, that's a lot of pressure, but it's good pressure. And one thing I would just say, if you were to ask me a question like, and what can make you successful with that type of vigilance, one key factor is to not do it alone. So whether that person supporting you and your time priorities is an assistant or a partner or co-managing partner or a spouse or even a kid. I remember there were times when my son was in high school and I was talking about not wanting to work on a certain day of the weekend or something. And there were times when he'd say, Dad, what are you doing? I'm working on something. And he said, do you need to work on that this weekend? And he wasn't being petulant or obnoxious. He was reminding me of what I had committed to. And we need the people around us, whoever they may be, to support us. This is not, leadership, as you know, is not a solo sport. And something like this with time, where there's so many outside influences, so too there can be wonderful outside influences to support us. So we're not alone in doing this.
It's good. You've said a couple of things that I want to go a little deeper on. One is that construct of reflection. And in one of your podcast episodes, you said something that was really profound to me. So I'm going to remind you of what it was and hoping that you might be able to give us some additional insight. But was this whole concept of this sort of spiritual construct around finding your purpose and going and out there and creating your purpose. And you said something so profound that when we have that construct of going and striving and trying to find it or create it, as opposed to that discovery of it indwells in us already, we already possess it. And how do we discover purpose in that reflection? There was something really, I don't know, freeing when I heard you say that. And when you're thinking about leaders and asking them to be reflective on, like you said, how do they find, what behaviors did they choose that created the outcome of prioritized time for coaching? What can you say about that sense of purpose creating versus purpose discovery or purpose finding, as it would be?
Yeah, I know that some people, in fact, some guests on my podcast are very adamant that, you don't create your purpose, you discover your purpose. You don't manufacture it. It comes from within you. And they could be much more articulate, honestly, about that than I could, including, for example, my friend Aaron Hurst, who wrote a wonderful book called The Purpose Economy back in the mid-20 teens, and who's a researcher on these things. And I am no researcher, as you know. And what I would say is that, let me use a little bit of an example, if it fits, and I'm sure you'll tell me. I've heard people say, in the context of relationships and romance and partnerships, that there's a difference between I love you and I love how I feel when I'm with you. I love who I am when I'm with you. Because that experience of being with you, because of who you are and the synergies and the energies and whatever it might be, magic, however you define that, that's a different podcast, is activated in such a way that something inside me sort of comes alive in a certain way around you in our relationship. And I think that's can be true with purpose as well. Like when I'm doing certain things, I'm just brought alive in that way. I feel a sense of meaning. This is what I'm here to do. There's the ikigai thing that you're probably familiar with. There's different ways to describe this. Yeah, but there's this notion of like, there's also a wonderful model that comes from a book called How to Find Your Mission in Life by Richard Bowles, Bowles, the guy who wrote What Color is Your Parachute? And he has his book, How to Find Your Mission in Life, is a deeply spiritual book. He has a very, very strong Christian faith. that you don't know at all in the parachute book, which I'm sure has bought him 20 houses around the world at this point in time, and a wonderful, wonderful resource. But and he describes it with 3 different questions as well. And I'm going to let your listeners figure out what that is, or we could put it in the show notes if you like. But it's like, what do you discover about yourself that that shows you where you want to serve and how you want to serve? Which of my gifts do I want to use? Which are the things I realize I don't even know if it's a gift until in this circumstance it's a gift? Who are the people I want to serve? What's the impact I want to have? And those questions, I mean, yeah, I could ask those questions. I need to go find that place. And that may be where we begin the journey. But I think ultimately it is more about recognizing what lights us up inside. But I think we can't know that until we start. It's a bit of a hero's journey thing. We don't know until we go out there. It's a bit like you sometimes don't know. You have to cross a line to know where the line is sometimes. And you have to cross into places like I needed to know. I was listening to, forgive me, I'm jumping around a little bit, but I think you might have, I was listening to Arthur Brooks recently. You know Arthur Brooks?
Oh, I love his work. Yes.
Yeah. So Arthur Brooks was talking about, we need to be unhappy in order to learn. And we need to be unhappy in order to grow. We need to be, the more weak and vulnerable we are, the more open to learning we are, the more exposed we are. And I've had some experiences in the last 6 months, just in terms of living a different way and a different thing. I don't to bore your listeners with that, but I can recognize this thing that says, well, you know what, when I don't have my support structures around me in a certain way, and I don't have some of these, habitual things, different stimuli and different experiences and different feelings and different thoughts and whatever can reach me in a different way. And I think that's part of it. But we need to have the experiences out there in order to experience the difference ourselves and inside. So I think it's a little bit of both. I hope you don't feel I'm dodging your question. It's an internal thing, but it's informed by external experiences.
Without a doubt. But it really comes back, and the through line of this conversation, and I am absolutely reminded we're going to do a part 2. So we should just accept that we're not going to talk about all the things we're going to be able to talk about.
Acceptance.
Yeah. Exactly. But what I'm pulling from this notion is the recognition is that there are external factors that we have to take into consideration. And those factors in the struggle particularly will awaken or enliven some kind of observation or experience or emotion. It's though that the solution though, rarely is it an out there. It's an in here and how I'm responding to the out there that then gives me the access to the goal or the objective or the purpose or the anchoring, the behavior that allows me to get the outcomes that I really, really, really want for myself. So I think, again, we spoke about that, about the time, and then again around discovering purpose. I think the other thing that I'm so glad you said, because it happens to highly correlate with things like customer or client loyalty, is that when we think about our objectives in relationships, we think, my goal is for you to like me. My goal is for you to know me. My goal is for you to trust me. And if a person is known, liked, and trusted, that often creates a sense of alignment or loyalty or connection. But when we stop at that level, we're missing out on what really drives true connection. I'd even say spiritual connection, that it's not just about you to know me, trust me, and like me. It's about, do you like you? Do you trust you? Do you know yourself more when you are in my presence? And when you can create that outcome as a leader for your people, or you can do that with your client, and where your client likes who they are when they're doing business with you, that's that next level of engagement. That's that next level of performance. So I'm thrilled that you brought that in to the equation.
There's a lot there to unpack for sure. And it reminds me a bit of, there's a wonderful thread of thought in a number of leadership books about how I think it relates to what we're talking about. From a leadership capacity, good leaders, arguably the best leaders, don't build loyalty to themselves. They build loyalty to the mission. And I think that's what we're talking about.
That's exactly what we're talking about. And the mission is rarely The mission's always bigger. There's always a bigger sense, which again, I think comes full circle as we come back to this idea of our spirituality and the concept of our leadership journeys. Andrew, if someone were listening right now and they wanted to take a meaningful step to be reflective, if they were willing to entertain the concepts of acceptance or forgiveness or love as a part of their leadership affect, what are some practical things that you would recommend people do or explore in order to go deeper? What would you recommend?
Gratitude is huge. Gratitude is just the nutrient-rich soil for growing positive things in our lives, because we are connected to some very positive and powerful forces as human beings, and the world is, this is strong language, but I don't think it's too strong. The world can be designed to make us forget. So how do we remember who we are and what's available and what's really going on, and how fortunate, just how incredibly fortunate we are to be even having these conversations and listening to these conversations and engaging in these conversations. And if you think about just, how many billion people, 8 billion, 9 billion now on the planet? And just in terms of what we're doing and what we're able to do. So a gratitude practice is huge, and that doesn't need to be some monstrous thing. It could be like is my practice, and it's always evolving, thankfully, is at the end of the day, what at what moments today was I really lit up? What went well? What small role or big role did I play in that? Because maybe I was just lucky. Maybe I was just fortunate. I'm grateful that this good bit of luck happened, but maybe it's no, and I'm grateful for my contribution to it because I did ABC. But to even ask those simple questions, it connects a bit to like Rick Hanson's work about negativity bias and the need for us to take in the good. So create some time for yourself to take in the good very deliberately. And again, that doesn't need to be a solo practice. It could be like, well, let's put it this way. I would imagine that it probably, and I think this has happened with us, if we're having coffee or something, I'm going to say to you, tell me about something great that happened to you this week. And so I can be a gratitude cultivating partner for you. And some of it is, you could say, well, what's the purpose of that? Well, is it just to feel good? And you could say, well, maybe, and feeling good does have its own benefits, but it also redirects our attention to what we did, because we had an agency, we had a role in this. And if I remember, most of us have a tendency to replay in our heads those meetings where we screwed up. We don't have a tendency to replay in our heads, and this is a lot of Rick Hanson's work too. We don't have a tendency to replay where we knocked it out of the park. And I'm not talking about exaggerating or hyperbole. We're really saying, you know what, that worked because I did X. And maybe with the grace of the support of these other people, but I was a part of it. And we need that. It's very practical, and it creates this virtuous cycle of what our minds then become a little bit more likely to recognize moving forward.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to summarize what I've learned from you, and I learn from you every time we talk. I think that the gratitude practice is such a powerful yet simple place for leaders to orient. Secondly, I love this idea of the intention of what it looks like to not try to find time, but to choose time and to choose it in a way that aligns very deeply with those values, with that sense of purpose. And I absolutely encourage people, as you were describing, have the courage to use appreciative inquiry on yourself and others. Because when we ask those, capture the good, find the light, notice when you were getting it right or when you were making it happen, by orienting our brain to ask those questions of others and of ourselves, I think it awakens and gives us a whole new experience of what it means to flourish as a human. Thank you for this conversation.
And one other little thing that I would throw in here is, and I'm just aware of this at this moment, like, I think we need to remember that life is short. Life is really short, and it goes by fast. So it's, yes, how do you want to use your wild and precious life? There's a lot that's been written about this, but what do you need to say to the people around you who matter the most? And what do you need to remind yourself, because you matter the most in your life? Because it could be done. We could put our heads on the pillow and it's done. And we live in a crazy, volatile world right now. That's, so what needs to be said? What do I need to do? What do I need to remember? And that typically, I believe anyway, involves who are the people that matter the most, our loved ones, our loved colleagues, et cetera, not just family, but what do we need to say? Because life goes by quick and I don't want to leave a lot unsaid.
What a perfect note. I'm going to make sure that our listeners know how to connect with you at Lighthouse Consulting, at your website, Lighthouse Teams. I'm going to include a link to your podcast, Spirituality and Leadership. And I can't wait for us to do this again. Thank you, my friend. I adore you. And I am so grateful that you are a part of my loved colleagues that's now newly in my life. Be well. We'll see you soon. And until next time, thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. If today's conversation sparked something in you, we hope you'll carry it forward with curiosity, compassion, and courage. Subscribe to the show, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who needs it. Until next time, keep exploring what it means to be fully human.